All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Exodus. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 21 through 23. And it's true, it's a big chunk. We won't hit all the details for the sake of time, but we'll hit enough to help you understand how to read this section. And before we do that, we need to make sure we keep the overall context in mind as to where we're at in the book of Exodus. We looked in chapters 19 and 20 as God began to make his covenant with the people of Israel. Well, chapters 21 through 23 continue that very same theme. In fact, Exodus 24 verse 7 refers to this section as the book of the covenant. That probably also includes chapter 20 as well. What happens there in chapter 24 is Moses will read all of this that we're going to look at in this recording to the people, probably also chapter 20 as well, and refers to it as the words and the laws of the Lord. It is the book of the covenant. And we must keep that language in mind. That's why we paused and had that special study on covenant. These instructions in chapters 21 through 23 are part of God's covenant with this particular nation, Israel. This material is what Israel must do to live out her identity as God's people, as a holy nation, as a kingdom of priests. We talked about that in chapter 19, and that vocation is specifically described in chapters 19, verses 4 through 6. Well, in order to embody that status and that identity of being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, there's a certain way they're going to have to live. And these regulations that we'll see in chapters 21 through 23 describe at least some of what God wants them to do to embody that. In addition to that, much of what is laid out in these chapters functions as what might be called legal wisdom. A lot of it is like case law, giving specific examples of things that might happen, and if this happens, here's what you need to do. In fact, a lot of it are specific examples of how to apply the Ten Commandments to situations in everyday life. And in that way, it provides sort of like examples of legal reasoning so that the leaders of Israel will know how to live out God's instructions in their time and in their place. So that by giving them specific examples, these cases, it teaches them how to think and teaches them how to reason so that they can wisely apply it to other situations that aren't specifically mentioned here in these chapters. That's sort of how this whole section is designed to function. It provides, as I said, legal wisdom. And because of all that, we must remember that the regulations here reflect what one author called God's ways in Israel's days. This is God accommodating himself to their culture. The format is really important. If this, then that. That's what I mean by case law. If this happens or this case should occur, here's what you should do. And it is simply a way of acknowledging that there are aspects of ordinary life that need regulating, that need some instruction on how to deal with those things. It's not commanding that these things need to be this way. It's regulating the kinds of things that were common in everyday life in their time and place. And as a result, it's teaching Israel how to bring about order, that is righteousness, and justice to their world that they are currently living in. And that means that there's going to be similarities in some of these case laws to other law codes from that time and place. And we have examples of other ancient Near Eastern law codes, and we can see there are some similarities. We can also see there are significant differences between those law codes and what God gives Israel here. Usually, these differences show up in who is protected and how they are protected. That's really important. So as you read through this, you're going to want to pay attention to who's protected and how are they protected. What you'll see is that these laws often aim to protect the poor and vulnerable from the rich and powerful. That was not normal in the ancient Near East. In fact, oftentimes there were different penalties for someone who is rich versus someone who is poorer or a commoner. Not so in the laws given to the nation of Israel. So all of this, these kinds of regulations that we'll see in these chapters, all of this will enable Israel to live out their identity as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, showing a different way of doing life to the nations around them. So, at the very end of chapter 20, remember, Exodus 20 is where God gives the 10 commandments. That's the tag for that chapter. And at the end of that chapter, God restates that they have to have absolute loyalty to himself, no idols, and that there's a proper way to worship him. And so the end of chapter 20 talks about building an altar, and here's how you need to come before me. You can't just do whatever you want. And then chapter 21 opens like this. It says, "Now these are the ordinances which you are to set before them." And then, as I noted, what follows in chapters 21 through 23 is a bunch of regulations for Israel as a nation. And we're not going to cover all of these regulations in detail for the sake of time, but we're going to look at least a good majority of them to help us learn how to read these kinds of laws well. And then at the end of this recording, we'll give some general guidelines for how these regulations can teach even us today some wisdom. All right, so that's the plan here. So let's jump in 21 verse 2 with the first case law. It's a case law that, again, is going to maybe grate against our ears, but it's describing a regular, ordinary, everyday situation in their time and place, and God's offering some wisdom for how to deal with it. And we're going to have to think this through carefully. So Exodus 21 verse 2 says, "If you buy a Hebrew slave," there's the specific situation. There's a case law. If this, then that. And here's the then part. "If you buy a Hebrew slave, then he shall serve you for 6 years. But on the 7th year, he shall leave as a free man without any payment to you." Notice that. Who's being protected? This particular worker, this particular servant, and he's being protected by, he's not going to be your slave, your servant, your worker in perpetuity, forever. And when he leaves, he's free to go and doesn't have to pay you a thing. This is putting essentially a term limit on like contracted labor. And that's the idea here. So here's a case that would come up in everyday life. Here's God's regulating this case. We also need to think through the word slave, because that word paints a picture in our language that is not exactly identical to what this Hebrew word actually refers to. The Hebrew word is ebed. And that word is oftentimes more like a bonded laborer or a servant than what we mean by the word slave. In fact, we will see very shortly down below that there's no such thing as like human trafficking. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about slave trade or anything like that. That's actually explicitly outlawed in these very regulations, and it's outlawed with a very stern penalty. We'll see that in a bit. This word ebed just most generally refers to a worker, and it had a wide range, a whole spectrum of uses in the Old Testament, from workers who had no freedom to employees to everything in between. So it's just a general word for a worker. Notice here in verse 2, he's a Hebrew worker. That's interesting because the word Hebrew eventually comes to refer to the Israelites themselves. But it seems like, to the best we can tell in its original use throughout the ancient Near East, it seems like this word Hebrew originally referred to poor, landless bands of people who survived by selling their work to other people. So that's the idea here. In fact, the word buy doesn't mean what we mean by the word buy. It means acquired, not like directly purchased and became the owner of. In fact, in Deuteronomy 15:12, this very word describes people who sell their work to someone else. And that seems to be the idea here. You're acquiring a worker. You're contracting with a worker. And so that seems to be the social situation being described here in this case law. It's not at all like slavery in the modern experience of human trafficking and things like that I mentioned. We'll see again the prohibition against that in verse 16. The situation here is there's a poor person who for some reason arranges with another person to work on their behalf. If that happens, in fact, Deuteronomy 15:18 refers to this person as a hired worker. That's what we have going on. If this poor person arranges with you to contract some labor for you, the contract terms can only be for 6 years. And that gives these poor workers distinct rights. And that was not the norm at all in the ancient Near East. Then in verses 3 through 6, it gives some instructions related to clarifying how this kind of contract and bonded service works, specifically how it works with regards to marriage. The main point of verses 3 through 6 is that marriage doesn't immediately let someone out of the terms of their service. Let me just read it so you can hear it. It says, if he, this contracted worker, comes alone, he will leave alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife will leave with him. If, notice all the ifs, the cases, if his master gives him a wife during his term of service and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children are going to stay with the master and he will leave alone. Again, that grates on our ears. We'll have to think about that here in a second. If the slave plainly says, look, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not leave as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God and bring him to the door of the doorpost, and he shall pierce his ear with an awl, and then he'll become his servant, his worker, permanently. Now, that last case is a little bit confusing. If his master gives him a wife, probably refers to if the person, the contracted worker, is given a wife from another contracted worker, well, getting married doesn't immediately let her out of her term of service. So if he only has a year on her terms, she has 5 more years on hers, then when he leaves, she doesn't just get out of her contract. You could see what kind of problems this would cause. And so what we're dealing with here is regulating these contracts and how to do that. Once the wife he was given, once her term is up, then she too is free to go and they could go together. That's the situation. In verse 7, we get another situation that sounds very strange to many of our ears, but once again was a practical part of everyday life, and God's offering actually some very countercultural regulation for the sake of the vulnerable. In this case, a young woman. Now, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she's displeasing in the eyes of her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. First of all, notice how all of this puts the master in his place. He doesn't have certain rights. He can't just do whatever he wants, and it even holds him accountable for his unfairness to her. We're regulating an unfortunate situation in their world. In this case, it's when it says a female servant or slave, it's not the word ebed, it's the word amah, and what that refers to is she's marrying into the family. So in other parts of the world today, this stuff still happens where you have a super poor family. They can't afford all their kids. And so when the daughter becomes of age, he basically gives her over to another family for a price, a bride price, and she marries into the family. That's the word amah. She is marrying into this other family. And it's like arranging for his daughter to be a servant bride. That's the idea. Think of how the wives, even of the patriarchs back in the book of Genesis, give their servants as wives to their own husbands. That's the same idea going on here. It's just part of ancient Near Eastern culture. And notice how this regulation is designed to protect the young woman so that she can't just be used and discarded. He can't sell her in the slave trade or anything like that. She has to be redeemed back by her family. Her family is allowed to liberate her from this situation and bring her back home if he decides he doesn't want her as his wife anymore. Verses 9 and 10 actually adds another new wrinkle to the situation. Well, what if the head of the household actually arranges for this young gal to be the wife of his son? What happens in that case? Well, verse 9 says, if he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. In other words, he's got to treat her like this is a legitimate marriage arrangement, and that means he has to pay a dowry, just like you would honor somebody in a normal marriage. And that dowry is really a protection for her. In case her husband dies, she has some funds to live off of. In case he decides to divorce her, she has some funds to live off of. That's what's getting at here. He has to deal with her according to the custom of daughters, which means there's going to be a dowry for her protection, almost like life insurance. And if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. So if this son decides he's going to marry somebody else, he still needs to actually provide for and care for this gal as well, even though she comes from a poor family. If he's not going to do these things, then she shall go free, and she doesn't have to pay anything. No money. She gets to go free and go back home. So if he's not going to care for her, then he can send her back home for complete free, nothing given to him. All of this is a way of regulating an unfortunate situation and protecting this young woman. Now, many of the regulations in these chapters 21 through 23, pertain specifically to the Ten Commandments, giving specific examples of those instructions and how those instructions apply in specific cases. And this is all, as I said in the intro, to help ancient Israel learn legal wisdom. So, in 21:12 and following, there are cases pertaining to commandment number 6, you shall not murder. So we get cases about murder and personal injury. So just listen to some of these so you can hear how they work and how they're connected to commandment number 6. So 21:12 says, he who strikes someone so that he dies shall certainly be put to death. All right, so you hit someone over the head with something, a rock or something, and they die, you're going to be put to death. Yet, if they don't lay in wait for him, if this wasn't premeditated, but God caused him to fall into his hands, then I will appoint a place to you which you may flee. We'll learn about these later. They're cities of refuge that they flee to, where they can be protected until the case can be investigated. If, however, someone is enraged against his neighbor so as to kill him in a cunning way, you are to take him from my altar and put him to death. So we're kind of dealing with murder versus involuntary manslaughter and how to regulate that. Verse 15 says, someone who strikes his father or his mother shall certainly be put to death. So if you strike and kill your father or your mother, then you're going to be held accountable for that. Verse 16, deals with that issue of human trafficking I mentioned above. Someone who kidnaps another, whether he sells him or he's found in his possession, he shall be put to death. No kidnapping, no human trafficking, strongly outlawed. So the entire idea of slave trading, well, that's a capital offense for the nation of Israel under God's regulation. A person can't be taken and forced to work for another. Verse 17, and someone who curses his father or mother, well, he shall be put to death. And so we're dealing with this issue of murder and manslaughter and personal injury, and how do we deal with all of that? And what you get in a lot of the following verses are case laws related to that. If someone does this and this is the result, then here's how you handle that. Again, all of this is to help them learn how to apply this. There's an interesting case in verses 20 and 21 that we should at least take a moment just to look at briefly. It says this: if someone strikes his male or female servant, his ebed, his worker, right, his contracted worker with a rod, and the worker dies at his hands, he shall be punished. Literally, that phrase, he shall be punished in verse 20 is he, that is the slave, the servant, the worker, shall be avenged. Again, this is completely countercultural, giving this worker dignity and rights that nowhere else did they have. And consistently in Scripture, the idea of this word where he, the servant, shall be avenged, the idea is that the culprit himself shall be put to death. So it seems that this provision is saying a master who beats his contracted worker to death, well, himself will be subject to investigation, with the ultimate penalty being the death penalty. This probably actually helps us understand verse 21 a little more too, because verse 21 is a little confusing. If, however, the worker survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for the servant is his property. We got to think through the translation. I think the translation causes us some confusion. So when it says no vengeance shall be taken, it's the same word as he shall be avenged in verse 20. There's a direct parallel there. And so the idea seems to be if the servant survives, then the death penalty is off the table. Now, some of the other things in there, like the slave is his property, literally is the ebed is his silver, which actually means the ebed is his worker and is what makes him money. So the master has suffered loss by this guy not being able to work, and that means the ebed doesn't have to pay for lost time. That seems to be the idea. So the penalty, there's no penalty for the worker. There's no death penalty for the master if the servant or the worker survives. That seems to be the idea. All these cases here are related to commandment number 6 about not murdering. You shall not murder. Now let's jump down to verse 33 and we get some cases related to commandment number 8. You shall not steal. So this has to do with matters of personal property. So listen, if someone opens a pit or digs a pit and doesn't cover it, and an ox or a donkey, someone's property, falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. He shall give money to the owner of the donkey or the ox, and the dead animal shall become his. If someone's ox injures another person's ox so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide its proceeds equally, and they shall also divide the dead ox. We're talking about how do we deal with issues of personal property, and what's the proper way to make restitution with things that happen related to that. These kinds of cases related to a person's property, commandment number 8, they actually continue as we move into chapter 22. So you get if someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, well, then he's going to have to pay back 5 oxen for the ox or 4 sheep for the sheep. In fact, notice the restitution is higher than what he even took. And so all of this is aimed at helping the nation of Israel learn legal wisdom, learn how to think these things through, and learn how to apply the 10 Commandments to their cultural context, to their situation. You get an interesting one in chapter 22, verse 5. If someone lets a field or a vineyard be grazed bare and lets his animal loose so that it grazes in another person's field, well, then he's going to have to make restitution from the other person's field. So his animal somehow got free and ate a bunch of grain out of the other person's field. Well, you're going to have to make restitution for that. If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes and stacked grain or standing grain, or the field itself is consumed, one who started the fire has to make restitution. I always find that one fascinating. In the place where I live, it's very common to see farmers with torches burning weeds out of their irrigation ditches. Well, if one of those fires gets out of control, burns somebody's cornfield, guess what? Got to make restitution for that. That's the idea. Now, at the end of chapter 22, you get a little random collection of various laws in 22:16 through 31 that don't seem to pertain directly to the 10 Commandments and don't seem to have any unifying theme. They're just other random collection of laws that are pertinent to, again, their cultural time and place. And so you get things like, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. Or whoever has sexual intercourse with an animal must be put to death. They violated the order of things. Whoever sacrifices to any other god other than the Lord alone well, he shall be utterly destroyed. So you get these random commands and instructions and case laws at the end of chapter 22. And then as we move into chapter 23, there are cases related to commandment number 9, bearing false witness. So you get in 23:1, you shall not give a false report. Don't join your hand with a wicked person to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the crowd in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to join together with a crowd in order to pervert justice. Right? So don't conspire with others to say, here's what we're going to say, and here's what we're going to say, and we're not going to say that. This is our story. Let's make sure we get it right. And so you give false testimony when you're trying to sort out a dispute. In 23:8, another common situation in their time and place, in parts of the world today, you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of a just. So when we're trying to deal with a court case, you can't pay off judges. You can't take a bribe as far as being a false witness. That's actually going to pervert justice. In 23:10, we get a case related to commandment number 4, the Sabbath, and it helps us realize, the Sabbath is bigger than just a weekly observance. And so it says this in 23:10, now you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather its yield, but in the 7th year you're going to let the land rest and lie uncultivated, so that the needy of your people may eat, and so they can gather from volunteer wheat, volunteer barley, other grains, and they can gather that. Not only that, but for 6 days you're to do your work. So here's a specific Sabbath. On the 7th day, you're going to cease from your labor so that your ox or your donkey may rest. Notice that. God's concern for the ox or the donkey. Again, here's some case laws to help them think through this rhythm of 6 and 1, 6 and 1, 6 days and a day of rest, 6 years for your fields, and then a year of rest for the land. And then finally, we get some cases related really and kind of loosely to commandments 1 through 3, commandments about no other gods, no idols, or taking the Lord's name in vain. And so you get verse 13, sort of this general statement that says this of chapter 23, verse 13, now concerning everything which I've said to you, be careful. Do not mention the name of other gods, nor let them be heard in your mouth. And then you get instructions for 3 main feasts. They're going to be part of their annual calendar as a nation. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Tabernacles. These are going to be 3 key feasts for their annual calendar. And then chapter 23 ends by describing how God is going to lead them into the land of promise by means of his messenger, whom they need to listen to and obey because God's name is in him. And obeying God's voice, God's name, honoring his name is critical to keeping the 3rd commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And so they need to keep God's instructions. And if they do that, they'll be blessed in the land that they're going into. And God actually ends the whole section by giving the reason it's so important that they drive the current inhabitants of the land out. He says, for I will hand over the inhabitants of the land to you, and you will drive them out from you. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land. Why is that so important? Otherwise, they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will be a snare to you. So you got to drive them out so that they won't lead you into sin and into disloyalty to the covenant and to God himself. All right, we've hit some of the key things out of chapters 21 through 23. And let me just wrap this up with some theological reflection. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 says, all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching and preaching and all that sort of thing. Well, so how is this section useful? We're not the Israelites. This is not our covenant. We're under a new covenant. We're not living in the deserts of southern Sinai in 1400 BC. Our culture is not the ancient Near Eastern culture, although as human beings, some of the same issues still persist. And so we must remember that these regulations are part of God's covenant with ancient Israel, not our covenant. But All Scripture is useful. So how? How so? Well, I think the key answer, the basic answer to that is what we see in these kinds of regulations that God gives the nation of Israel at this time and place is we see patterns of righteousness. Much of this is case law, and it intends to regulate life in their time and mitigate some of the wrongness of life in their time. It's what I like to refer to as down-to-earth spirituality. God accommodates to the time and place where people live, and what he's doing by giving all these cases is he's giving a very down-to-earth spirituality, down-to-earth instructions to say, in your time and place, where you live, where life is like this, and these kinds of things happen, here's what I want you to do. And in doing that, it offers paradigms and patterns of righteousness that can help us gain wisdom and discernment for how to apply God's commands to our fallen human situations. If you want a thoroughgoing treatment of this, there's a great book called Old Testament Ethics for the People of God by Christopher Wright, one of my favorite Old Testament scholars. It is a fairly large book, and it's really detailed and in-depth. So if you want a thoroughgoing treatment of it, Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. But as we read thoughtfully and reflectively, we can gain wisdom for dealing with life in our world too. Let me offer one specific example that I think is helpful to us, just to help us see how it might work. When my son was like 5 or 6 years old, we were at a flag football game with a group of college students. One of the college students had just brought a dog that he had gotten from a rescue shelter. It was a pit bull. And pit bulls are notorious for having moments where it's like, oh man, they go a little bit violent. Well, he brought this dog to this sporting event where there was lots of people and kids. And the dog seemed fine for a little bit. And then all of a sudden the dog got aggressive and bit my son right across his face. Thankfully, he didn't get him super bad or super hard, but we didn't have him to go to the doctor. Well, we have this law in this very section about if an ox gores a person, then you need to put the ox to death. And if the ox has a habit of goring and you haven't put him to death, then you're responsible for that. Well, in this case, since this person had gotten this dog from an animal shelter, didn't know its history, but also knew the tendency of pit bulls and knew that if they bit once, then there's a good chance they might bite again. This person, I think, did the responsible thing and took his dog and had his dog put down. He didn't want to be responsible for a dog that bit somebody and did serious damage to somebody. That is taking the wisdom of a little law about an ox goring another person and applying it to a modern situation. The wise thing to do might be this pit bull might be dangerous, and I don't want to be responsible for that, right? That's what these laws do. They can help us gain some wisdom for how to think these kinds of situations through. There's some key questions that we could ask as we read these kinds of laws that could be helpful. And I've kind of gathered just a handful from Chris Wright in Preaching Old Testament Law. He says this. Here's some of the key questions as we read the law. What does this law show or reflect about the character of God? What bad situation was this law trying to prevent? What kind of better situation does this law promote? What kind of moral values or principles can you discern in this law? Well, as we read the laws with those kinds of questions in mind, it'll help us maybe gain some wisdom into insight into how we, as the kingdom of priests and a holy nation today, how we can embody God's wisdom in our time and place. And let me offer then just one final thought on how these kinds of regulations are useful for us. They're useful in the sense that they look ahead to Christ and the new covenant. The Apostle Paul reminds us that the law was holy and righteous and good. These kind of commands were holy and righteous and good, but they weren't the end of the story. That law did pass on God's righteousness, but it didn't have the power, the Apostle Paul teaches, to make people righteous. So now, righteousness is found in Christ apart from the law, and it's empowered by the Spirit. That's one of the major themes of the book of Romans and the book of Galatians. And so these kinds of laws are useful in helping us maybe learn some of God's wisdom, but we live now further along in the story where God's Spirit is the means by which we become righteous people and we live wise lives where we're at, because the Spirit dwells within us, enabling us to do the kinds of things, the kinds of good and holy and righteous things that the law pointed towards, but it wasn't able to always make people do. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the book of Exodus. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So, if you're one of those who supports this ministry, thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com. You can click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, where you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it monthly, click a little box that says Make This Monthly. All those donations will come this way so that this ministry can continue to grow and increase and help more people learn and live the Bible. Thanks a ton for your support.